You may remember from August 2020 the massive explosion at the port in Beirut, Lebanon. There were 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that were being stored. They had confiscated those from a ship nearby. It was being improperly transported, so then they took it and they improperly stored it, and the building that it was in caught fire, and then it exploded. It caused immense damage, 218 deaths, 7,000 injuries, approximately $15 billion in property damage, left about 300,000 people for the time being homeless. It's estimated to be one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in recorded history. It was felt in every part of the country of Lebanon. It was also felt in additional countries, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Israel, heard as far as the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, and it registered as a 3.3 on the Richter scale traditionally used to measure earthquakes. What's fascinating is that because of the era of cell phones and because there was a fire already happening where it was being stored, there were dozens, maybe even more, of people who were filming the fire who didn't know they were about to film the explosion. And in so many of these videos, they seem to be a great distance away. You'll see and hear the explosion, and then you feel almost through their camera and see the energy of the explosion reaching them. Some of them are knocked down, some of them their phone is knocked out of their hand, some of them run when they feel the blast reaching them. It's a fascinating, even almost difficult to explain phenomenon, that you see the evidence for it, and then some short time later you feel the effects reaching the point of view of the camera. I think we can think back plenty of times, probably even just from this past week or two, where we say words and then we brace for their impact because we probably know we ought not to have said them, or ought not to have said them the way that we said them, or ought not to have said them at the time that we said them. I can think of two clear instances. One from Friday night, which was clearly not the best of motives for me. Someone was a little strong with me, so I was a little strong back. One from the week before. I was definitely in a good frame of mind and trying to be kind at the funeral home, and I really wish I could have this phrase back. Trying to offer comfort, but just didn't say the wisest thing. We say words, we brace for their impact because we know the harm that words can do. The good news as we read through Proverbs is that, yes, we do have plenty of warnings when it comes to the danger that words can yield. But we also have plenty of good news, plenty of promises about the health and the vitality that sound, wise words can then bring. This explosion doesn't have to only illustrate a poor use of words. It can just as easily illustrate healthy use of words. That we speak words and then we brace for the impact, but the impact is positive. It's uplifting, it's life-giving. They are healing. We recognize that communication is necessary. It's a necessary component for all of our relationships. Therefore, our wisdom or our lack thereof will always be clear in how we communicate with words. So let's notice wisdom's words. And before we get into a list of 10 proverbs about speech, I want us to notice three broad categories. And I think you can see elements of these categories in a combination of all the proverbs that we'll notice. But what I hope we see is that any resource, even secular resource that talks about communication, is going to mention these three things. And often you'll see these qualities attributed maybe to the formalization of them, say to the Greeks and their philosophers. But what I hope we notice is that these have always been present. In a historical way, in a literary way, they pre-existed even the Greek philosophers because we see them from the writings of Solomon here in Jewish literature. But even before that, they pre-existed because they all come from God. that all of his words fit all of these communication principles. So the first would be content. There are literal messages, words that are spoken. There are facts, details that are communicated. The Greeks would call this the logos, the placeholder, the truth, the thing that represents the concept. So content would be the first principle. But then you also have quality, which is how it's said. The tone of voice, the attitude with which we say it, the tenor of the voice. Greeks would call this pathos, related to empathy or sympathy. It's the idea of being persuasive. There are some people you can take two groups of people and they say the same exact words, but one can convince more effectively than the other with the same words. Well, why is that? It's because of how they say it. But the third, as Jesus is going to make clear, is the most important, which is character. Who is it that's saying these things? The integrity to back up the words, the action related to the words, the relationship between us and the receiver of the message. This will be called ethos, the ethics behind the communication. What we find is that when Solomon or whomever is writing some of these proverbs talks about the communication principles of life, the result only happens, the life-giving power of words happens because of a combination of all three of these things. It's always truthful, it's always honest, it's always building up, it's always going to be said with the right motives and the right heart, but it's also said by people who are living out the very wisdom that they're talking about. So let's go through 10 of these, and then we'll turn our attention to how Jesus fulfills all of them. Proverbs 15:23, to make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good it is. This ended up becoming kind of the key verse for our study because I made a master list of possible ones we could include in tonight's study. And as I was trimming that list down and trying to figure out which ones were best for what we were accomplishing, I had written this one down twice. So I figured that meant let's zero in on this. An apt answer, an appropriate answer, a fitting answer. A word in season reminds us of timing. There are certain seasons for certain plants and certain seasons for certain actions in our lives. We dress differently depending on the season. Words are also timely. And the Proverbs writer in verse 23 here is saying that when an answer has been thought through and it's appropriate and it's seasonal in that it addresses what's happening, what's going on, it's aware of that and it's respectful of that, then it's always going to bring joy. It's refreshing when we hear someone give an apt answer. It's refreshing when someone is respectful of the situation and of the season. So as we move forward, I think some of these will help us to see what exactly an apt answer looks like. Certainly as we turn our attention to Jesus in a moment, he'll show us what an apt answer looks like. Proverbs 12, verse number 17, whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. The test for a, quote, truth teller is not whether or not they claim to tell the truth. It's not even really do they believe they're telling the truth. It's do they give true evidence that proves they're telling the truth. Take one person who's deceptive, and that person convinces multiple people. Now, all of those people think they're telling the truth, but they're just repeating what someone else said. But someone who's actually concerned about the truth is going to be able to share evidence in an effective way. You see the combination of logos and pathos there? Here's the facts, but here is a description in such a way that's persuasive about the reasonable, logical facts. Very next verse, Proverbs 12, verse 18. There is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts. They do damage, they harm, they cause wounds. But the tongue of the wise brings healing. It may even be that the sword imagery is supposed to be carried on into the latter half of the verse too. That there's almost a surgical or medicinal type perspective toward this. That instead of using the tongue to harm, it's used to heal and to bind up, just as a surgeon would. And with that one in mind, think about Hebrews 4. The Word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword. It pierces down in between the soul and the spirit, the thoughts and the intents of the heart. True words, honest words, bring healing. And of course, Jesus is depicted in the opening chapters of Revelation as having that tongue that's like that two-edged sword, that's sharp. Same chapter, verse 25. Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad. This is not meant to blame other people for our continual anxieties or depression-like seasons, but it does remind us of the power of healthy words. We'd probably need to remind ourselves that a good word can come from ourselves. If we find ourselves in a season of anxious thinking and anxious thoughts, despair-type symptoms, and we're continually repeating untruths to ourselves, we would do a lot to learn from this verse, to instead replace them and tell ourselves, quote, good words, true things, in order to dissipate the anxieties that do take over in our hearts from time to time. Next chapter, Proverbs 13, verse 17, a wicked messenger falls into trouble, but a faithful envoy brings healing. So the imagery is a messenger sent, and if he's sent for wicked purposes, well, eventually his message is going to cost him his life. It's going to cause trouble. But a faithful messenger, maybe even a faithful group of messengers, they eventually bring healing. It just reminds us of the importance of relationships and the importance of who we're listening to. Are the people we're listening to the most and giving power over our emotions and over our dispositions? Are they faithful? If so, then they pose to give us healing. Chapter 15, verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. We don't have to go far before we find someone who's engaging us in a negative way. There's a lot of hurt people in the world, and hurt people often hurt people. Well, how do we de-escalate? How did Jesus de-escalate when hurting people were trying to hurt him? It was always with a soft answer. Sometimes a strong answer that was also soft. An answer of truth, an answer of a graphic image, but yet said in such a way that if they would listen, would actually de-escalate the wrath. So we can respond to a tenuous situation with more anger, with more harshness, and keep it stirred up and probably even cause it to grow. Or we can be in control of our emotions and respond with a soft tone, a soft quality of self, pathos, in order to de-escalate the situation. Same chapter, verse 28. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. We don't have to speak. We don't have to speak immediately. It's okay to think through what we want to say. Not in a manipulative way to force an outcome, but in a thoughtful, wise way. Even in a way that says, I don't have to say anything other than to acknowledge that the other person has spoken. It may mean that we're not just pondering the content of what we're saying, but we're also pondering how we go about saying it. It may be that we take a quick moment to pray about what we're about to say. Two verses later, verse 30. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart. Good news refreshes the bones. Here you see how good news has the capacity to change our entire disposition. That our eyes change, that we get into a mode where we're trusting instead of adversarial. The light of the eyes change. Just think about this morning. We talked about Cain. Inwardly, he was full of wrath, and then his face fell. Well, that's the opposite of the opening phrase. We can see it in each other's dispositions when we get more anxious and more adversarial, or when we relax and become more trusting. And those who are able to communicate good news in good, faithful, wise ways typically are able to allow people to relax, to become calm, to become more trusting. And good news refreshes the bones. There's a health-giving quality. Some even suggest that the bones here is really deeper than just maybe what we think of external aspect of the bones, but even to the marrow of the bones, which is where so much of our life-giving qualities come from. We now know with science about the blood cells and how they generate through the bone marrow. So there's a regeneration idea behind good news that refreshes. And then 16 verse 24, gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. You've got the emphasis on honey because it is both tasty and also nutritious. It's antimicrobial, it promotes health, it's a good thing. We talk about it in allergy season because the bees that are flying all around us and pollinating plants that we're allergic to, we benefit from their work. But also think about how the honeycomb reference is a multiplier. Not only do we have the sweetness and the health that comes from honey, but we also have a constant source of it when gracious words are present. And finally, chapter 27 and verse 9, oil and perfume make the heart glad, and the sweetness, the sweet experience, just like oil and perfume, the sweetness of a friend. So there's relationship, there's character involved. The sweetness of a friend comes from his earnest counsel. We might say that's parallel to honest evidence from earlier, but there's an earnestness about how they communicate things, why they're communicating things, that the relationship is so important, that they want to and know they need to have this conversation, and it's, in the end, uplifting. So think about these 10 verses. There's a common thread, of course, just between the power of healthy, wise speech, but also the destructiveness of foolish speech. We also need to connect it to this overall theme on Sunday nights of recognizing our ability to respond to every situation. That's what responsibility means. Am I able to respond in any situation? That'll be clearly seen in our words. 1951 New York Giants in baseball. Most known for game-winning home run by Bobby Thompson, final inning, 2 outs, called the shot heard around the world. It ended a playoff series that they forced because they tied the Brooklyn Dodgers. So they had to play the best 2 out of 3. And people bought TV sets and listened all over the radio. It was one of the most watched games of the time. And then he hits this walk-off home run that sends them to the World Series. The guy in the on-deck circle was the rookie center fielder, and he was shaking and nervous, and he said he was praying that either Thompson would win the game or would get the final out so that he did not have to get to the plate. That rookie center fielder was Hall of Famer, Birmingham native Willie Mays, who went on to become one of the greatest players of all time. What created that series, though, was that they were down by a lot of games with just a few weeks left. But they went on a tear toward the end of the season. They won 40 of their last 54 games, 20 of their last 25 games in September to force the tie with the Dodgers. And so Mays himself said that for some reason they came together unlike any other team he'd ever played on. Another player was quoted as saying this: "We were helping one another out so much, it was unbelievable." Listen carefully. Response, Abel. We were still making errors and throwing to the wrong base, that kind of thing. They were not a great defensive team, even though Mays was playing center field. But even when they made an error, instead of getting on the culprit or giving him the silent treatment, everyone else would sort of swarm around him and shower him with encouragement and love. Isn't it fascinating how common that kind of an answer is? That you hear someone have great success on the field and you ask them, well, how is this possible? And they'll give you an answer based on something that happened almost off the field, beyond the game. They don't attribute it to someone just getting hot at the plate or someone doing something different with how they play. They get back to their relationships. And in this instance, this player said it all was evident in how we talked to each other. That when we messed up, we didn't get hard on each other. We built each other up. We encouraged each other. That was the way of them moving the other people on to the next play. So that impacts us because when we fall victim to blaming or complaining or defending, our three categories that we've opened this year with, these all undercut our responsibility. They keep us from doing what we ought to do. Whenever we do these three things, it'll always be with words. We're first going to think the words, and then if they see the light of day, we're speaking the words. So all these principles about keeping our tongues silent, biting our tongues, saying words that are healthy and are righteous and wise, they all directly impact our ability to respond. So from a positive standpoint, somehow I deleted the next slide, but whenever we are responsible, responsibility will also be seen in our words. So I think responsibility is your blank there in the bulletin. Responsible people are also the people who are known for controlling their tongues and for saying wise things. If you made a list of the 5, 10 most responsible, competent people that you know, and then you made a list of the 5 or the 10 best people in terms of encouraging talkers, people who can be trusted with their words, there would probably be a lot of overlap between those two lists. So as we think about applying these things, responsible people, people who are led by the principles of God and by truth, who refuse to lean on these crutches, will always be seen in our words themselves and in how we say them and what we don't say. So let's see wisdom's words in action, specifically in the life of Jesus. How is it that Jesus will model these things for us? How is he an example of someone who gives an apt answer, who gives answers that are healing and refreshing, that give honest evidence and earnest counsel? We're going to look at both of these passages from Matthew 11, but the first begins in verse number 2. We see Jesus' interaction with John the Baptist, because he's going to send word back to John the Baptist who is doubting, and he does so in a way that comforts him. So Matthew 11, beginning verse number 2. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." John's been arrested. He's preached a message multiple times, really, but he's especially preached a message that's harsh to the king and to his new wife and that family. And his expectations are no longer being felt or seen. He had this transition over to Jesus' ministry in mind. He knew it was going to happen. But you have to wonder, how much of the imprisonment did he expect? How long did he expect to have to wait before he saw Jesus take over more and more and become this clear Messiah that he was sent to reveal to all mankind? Well, Jesus' answer is what we would call an apt answer. But notice that he doesn't give John a simple, clear, but kind of superficial platitude. He doesn't say, "Oh, just don't worry," or "just hang in there." He doesn't look down on him, but he responds in such a way that gives him the ability to be responsible himself. Jesus' answer is helpful first because it's true. And then the way he says it is loving. It's true, that means it's verifiable. Look at all that he promised. Look at what all that he said. He said, go and tell John what you see and hear. These are some wild things. They're miraculous. Blind are able to see. The lame are able to walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf can now hear. The dead have been raised. And the poor have good news preached. But also notice that by sending this evidence back through messengers, John's messengers, they now become a source of comfort for John too. Jesus' answer is a source of comfort, but because it comes with messengers. So think back to that idea of a faithful envoy gives healing. There being this faithful envoy of words from Jesus to John. And John can say, all right, Jesus gives me evidence, and these people that I know and love, they saw it too. So that builds John up in a moment of his doubting. But also notice this, that the answer Jesus gives, the proof, the evidence, also carries John back to a time. It rewinds John's mind back to the time prior to his intense suffering. He's now in prison, but Jesus carries him back to when he was fulfilling that mission, when he's actively serving as the forerunner. And he's preaching, these are the kind of things you got to look for to know for the Messiah. John's difficulties, his suffering, has caused him to doubt. But Jesus is saying the very things you preached and promised, they're happening. They're true. They're unfolding just as you said they were and just as you heard them and knew them from God himself. But then verse 6 is powerful. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me. It's a broad, universal statement. It's true about everyone just as much as it's true about John. But Jesus is not insulting John's doubting by giving the statement. He's making a promise. If you can endure any circumstance without doubting me fully, without being offended by me, without going into a sense of private self away from everyone else and not acknowledging me, if you can remain public with your faith and confessing me, you'll always be blessed. He inspires and legitimizes John's agency. He trusts John to make the reasonable, logical decision based on what he already knew and now what he's being told. That's the power of honest evidence. Here's John, and he's doubting. Jesus doesn't water down the truth, he repeats the truth, but he does so in a way that allows John to believe once again. But now you move forward to the text. He addresses the crowd beginning in verse number 7. So you've got John the Baptist who doubts, and Jesus responds in a certain way. And then you've got the crowd that he knows is doubting inwardly, and he corrects their doubts. And he gives them an apt answer in much the same way that he gave John an apt answer, but he does so in a different manner. He doesn't adjust the truth. He doesn't adjust the content. See, that's the easy way. That's the way fleshly, foolish people change the answer, is by changing the facts. Jesus changes the approach. He changes the pathos, the ability to persuade. So let's read a few verses from this section, beginning verse number 10. This is he, speaking of John, of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. That's the prophecy about John. Then Jesus says this, verse 11, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. What was Jesus going to say about John the Baptist right after John the Baptist doubts? It's not, look at that doubter. It's not, don't doubt like John the Baptist did. How quick are we to do that in our own argumentation, to kind of guilt people into behaviors? Jesus gives us one of the greatest examples we could ever follow, is that when we talk about someone and they're not around, lift them up. I mean, if we could just do that one thing tonight and every day forward, what would change amongst the handful of us who are here tonight? That when we talk about someone comes up in conversation and they're not around, we praise them and talk about their good qualities and talk about how much we can learn from them. But also notice how he's going to compliment the crowd in a way. He knows they're doubting. He knows they're not going to accept the teaching. But he says, John the Baptist is greater than any person I know who's been born of woman. But if you'll follow me into the kingdom, you'll have more than John ever did. You'll get to see the promises that John preached about. You'll get to see them fulfilled. And so Jesus, instead of demeaning John or instead of demeaning the crowd, he lifts up John and says, now look at what you can enjoy if you truly follow me. It's genius communication. It's wise communication by Jesus to take this example of a faithful, righteous man in John and to use it to inspire in a positive direction those who would be willing to listen in the crowd. Let's keep reading. Verse number 18. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon, the Son of Man. He came as he was eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Wisdom is justified by her deeds. So it sounds as if Jesus is aware there are some in the crowd who will be receptive to this, and they need to know the one who's in the kingdom is greater even than John the Baptist. But he also knows there are those who are just not going to listen. They're antagonistic toward him. So he says, John the Baptist lived one way. He lived out in the wilderness, and he was contrary to the culture around him. And guess what? Y'all despised him. I've lived among you. I've, quote, become all things to all people, as Paul would say. And you've despised me for doing that. See, the problem is with them and their hearts. So what does he say next? He concludes it all by saying, wisdom is justified by her deeds. Who's he talking about? That's kind of the genius of his statement, isn't it? It sounds to me, when I read it at first, that it's talking about John the Baptist and about him. That their actions validate why they lived the way that they lived. John the Baptist separated from the people, Jesus amongst the people. But because it's a wide, true statement about wisdom, that it's justified by action, by character, it's also true about the enemies he's facing, right? That the people that cannot be satisfied, that John the Baptist wasn't good enough for them, and Jesus wasn't good enough for them, even though in some ways they were vastly different, their lack of wisdom is proven by their deeds, by their actions. So that's a powerful way to conclude and to kind of segue into where we leave things tonight, is that our words have great power to build up, to give life, or to tear down. But the greatest source, the greatest connection to words is, do our actions and our words match? Are they aligned? And when Jesus would talk about words, he would connect them to the heart. So what is the wise one? What does he say about words? Matthew 12, verse 33, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good. The evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. So I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. By your words you'll be justified, by your words you'll be condemned. He says you cannot keep it up for long. If the tree is bad, the fruit eventually will prove to be bad. If the tree is actually good, everybody will know it from your words. They'll be good. When we speak careless words, we reveal that we have a careless heart. That we're not attending to our hearts in a truly holy and a truly righteous manner. Therefore, God will use our own words for us or against us at judgment. If we speak good things out of a good heart, he'll say, your life was aligned. You did what you said you did. Your actions in private reflected your words in public. But if you speak good words, trying to do that out of an evil heart, he'll hold up those good words and say, your life didn't match it. You were a hypocrite. If you speak evil words, he'll say, well, this is the evidence that your heart was evil. You spoke evil things. And finally, Matthew chapter 15. He would say, verse 8, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. You see the misalignment. Verse 10, beginning verse 10, hear and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a person. Verse 18, what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. You ever noticed how whether it's Jesus or Paul or someone else, all of these lists are major toe steppers? Because it'd be easy for us to say, well, the murderers and the adulterers, those people are the worst. And yet here Jesus puts those people in the same line, the same list, with those of us who slander, those of us who have evil thoughts, who bear false witness. Why? Because the heart is in the same place for all of us. And whether it's a word or whether it's an action, it all is revealing what's in the heart. Purity does not come from an outward-only, fine-tooth comb approach to cleanliness laws. That's the point he's making in the context. But purity comes from looking at our hearts in the mirror and repenting and making adjustments based on the heart turning toward God. So as we challenge ourselves from the Word of God to bring our words into submission, it does start with the heart, but it always be seen in our words. Oftentimes, we have to catch ourselves, like these two moments that I mentioned from the past couple of weeks that I could circle and say, yeah, I missed it with my words. If we can catch the words, then we can work backward and identify the problem in the heart. Ask God to forgive our hearts, but also to recreate our hearts in His image, such that our words will then reflect His glory. Let's pray about our words and the week ahead before we offer the Lord's invitation. And dear God and Father, we thank you for the day that's been, for the time to begin the week in worship and praise to you. And we thank you for your wisdom. We're thankful for your words. We're thankful that you've given us your holy word, and that among these things we have instruction and reminders and inspiration about the power of our words. Help us to be people who exercise self-control and restraint, but also who speak life-giving words, encouragement, truth, and to say those things with love and patience and with a sense of calm. Help us to understand that the week ahead, whether it's work or school or serving others' needs, the opportunities that you give us to bring others closer to you with our words. Help us to view those relationships with great potential, to pray about them to you, to ponder how we answer, to always give honest and earnest evidence, to do so ultimately for your glory. We're thankful for Jesus, who used his speech in such a way that brought others nearer to you. Help us to live like him in all things, and especially as we contemplate our speech this week. We're thankful for him, most of all. It's in his name that we pray these things. Amen. The wisest decision that you can make tonight is to obey Jesus Christ. The wisest words you could ever say tonight are the words, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. And because of your belief in that truth, your submission then to him in baptism, to put him on where he forgives, where he saves, where he adds you to his church. We'd love to see you make that decision tonight. We'd love to help you make that decision if that's something you've been contemplating. If you need to come back to him as one who's not been living in wisdom, not been living in righteousness, you can choose to make your life right with him tonight as well. Please know that we're here to help you in any way that we can. We beg of you to come, to do so as we sing.